Egerton Sykes and all the waffle. During the early decades of the 20th century, a curious movement appeared on the fringes of British archaeology. It was a world largely of amateurs, local historians, antiquarians, clergymen and enthusiasts who spent their weekends walking the countryside with maps and notebooks. In 1921, Alfred Watkins proposed that ancient sites, churches, standing stones and other landmarks were sometimes connected by long, straight alignments across the landscape. He called them lays. His ideas attracted a devoted following and eventually led to the formation of the Straight Track Club. Others went considerably further. Ancient trackways, sacred landscapes, hill figures, and even enormous terrestrial zodiacs were claimed to survive in the British countryside. Most of these ideas would later be rejected by professional archaeology, but for several decades they inspired a remarkable subculture of independent researchers. Egerton Sykes was one of them. When I interviewed him in about 1981, he was 86 years old and the last surviving member of the Straight Track Club. But Sykes' life had ranged far beyond the English countryside. He had trained as an engineer and he worked as a soldier, a diplomat and a foreign correspondent. He had edited newspapers in 4 languages, lived through 2 world wars and 10 revolutions, and worked in 25 countries. In later life, his interests turned increasingly towards ancient history, archaeology, UFOs, and other unexplained phenomena. He belonged to an extraordinary generation of independent investigators, but, as I discovered, that didn't mean he believed everything they claimed. The original recording of my conversation with Egerton Sykes appears now to have been lost. What survives is the transcript originally published in Quicksilver Messenger magazine in Brighton, England. The voice you hear is therefore a reconstruction, but the words remain, and those are of Egerton Sykes.
After the trenches. In the early 1920s, at the close of the First World War, British amateur archaeology was in the doldrums. Nobody who had spent 4 years digging trenches in France was interested in doing anything of the kind in England. And it really looked at the time as if we had come to a dead end in anything but official archaeological work. However, the situation was changed by a man called Alfred Watkins, who was a photographer and expert on lenses. He was quite well known and had considerable professional status. In 1923, he published a book which revolutionized the entire archaeological field for a period of several decades. His book was called The Old Straight Track. The Old Straight Track. The basis of Watkins' theory was that prehistoric points of interest, Silbury Hill, Stonehenge and so on, had radiating from them a series of trackways which were indicated by standing stones, tumps, barrows and the like. What has never been worked out is whether these trackways radiated from central points or to them. That is something which many years of research has not been able to establish. It seems that every prehistoric monument was, to some extent, a holy site. The fact that they may have been used for purely secular purposes is neither here nor there, but they had acquired the veneration of many generations of people using these trackways. The principle was extremely simple. If you stood in a valley and were going in a given direction, you looked up to the surrounding hills, and on one of these hills you would see, outlined against the horizon, a standing stone marking the way. Occasionally these trackways would cross. Where this happened, you'd usually find some kind of establishment set up. It might eventually turn into a church, a monastery, or even into an inn for wayfarers. It made no difference at all. This was an automatic development, for where you have a crossroads, it's the most suitable place for setting up an establishment where you expect people to congregate. The Straight Track Club. This theory hit the archaeological world of amateurs, of which I include myself, rather like an atomic bomb. It suddenly opened up wide new horizons and possibilities. Some of these have not yet cleared up. In the early 1930s, an organization was formed called the Straight Track Club, of which I was a member until it finally died just before the war. Most of the books and literature were taken over by one of the members on the understanding that they'd be made available to all and sundry. Instead of this, he kept them locked up until he died. They were then handed over to a local library where they still are. There were 30 or 40 volumes of them. They consisted of very closely packed notes by people who had put in an immense amount of work with maps and compasses trying to sort things out. Too many lays. Since the folding up of the Straight Track Club, there have emerged several journals in the field. I like the journals, but I'm afraid the standard of research contained in some of them has not always been up to the standard which is essential for any serious progress to be made. I may give several examples. First of all, there is no relationship of any kind between ley lines and flying saucers. Second, although ley lines coincide to a considerable extent with the magnetic configuration of the region, this does not of itself prove anything for or against ley lines. Magnetic lines have been there for thousands of years, and although there are slight alterations every year when the magnetic pole shifts a few feet, they are not sufficient to justify anybody drawing wide conclusions upon them. It is easy to take ancient sites, link them up with a ruler, and call these lays. But one must remember that the population of Britain at the time was probably somewhere about 1 million, possibly less. And we have at the moment such a plethora of lays all over the place that it would take considerably more people to construct them. Therefore, it means that quite a lot of them would have to be eliminated simply because they were unnecessary. In my opinion, when the Romans came to Britain and built a marvellous system of roads, to a very great extent they followed tracks laid out generations before by the original setters out of the ley system. Emotional guff. There has been an awful lot of emotional guff talked about ley lines, which I find rather distressful. This is because I do think that when one is doing archaeological research as an amateur, you must apply certain rules of logic and common sense. For example, in years before the war, Mrs. Maltwood discovered the remnants of a zodiac round Glastonbury. During the war, Lewis Spence discovered one at Pumpersant in Wales, of which I published a description at the time. Since then, zodiacs have been cropping up all over the place like toadstools. Well, I'm frightfully sorry to say, but there was no necessity for such vast quantities of zodiacs that people claim to have discovered, none whatsoever. There were not enough people to make use of them. If you consult the best sources, Geoffrey of Monmouth, the Mabinogion, and the early French romances, not a single one of them mentioned zodiacs in any form or shape. I have looked through various Greek sources where, again, I've been unable to find any trace of a mention of them. We cannot discover anything which would justify the immense amount of energy involved in putting them in. And yet, it's absolutely definite that we do find them, though not in the quantities that some people suppose. Chapter 6. The Zodiacs. Sykes. We do not find any trace of any zodiac having been built since the departure of the Romans. We do find, for example, hill figures all over the place which were put up by the adherents of Epona or other fertility goddesses. But we find no notes at all on the construction of zodiacs. And yet they are there. This is something that the next generation will have to solve. I have a friend who has discovered remnants of hillside drawings within 20 miles of Brighton showing elephants' tusks. The questions that arise are, who put them there? What purpose were they intended for? I've not the slightest idea. No more has anybody else. If you have a zodiac, you may use it for astronomical purposes or something like that. But you've still got to justify that. Take the one at Glastonbury, for example, which probably occupies an area of between 5 and 6 square miles. The amount of work needed to make it must have been colossal. Why did people go to all this work? What did they want them for? An unsolved mystery. Now, I go back to lays. They covered practically every religious site in Britain. The fact is that religious sites turned into cathedrals and churches in the interim. For example, St. Paul's in London was built on the site of a building intended for the worship of Herne the Hunter. You can find reference to this in Christopher Wren's diary. Another example, Notre Dame in Paris was built on the site of a temple of Isis. The Champs-Élysées in Paris, the Elysian Fields, were probably originally on an Egyptian cemetery. These are things of which one has historical records, and it's fairly easy to check up on them. But no historical records of any kind have been produced referring to ley lines or zodiacs and their use. Now, this can only imply that whatever was done before historical records of any kind were kept, possibly by a different race or a different branch of the human race. And let me hurriedly say that we are not supposing that they were put up by alien invaders landing from spacecraft or anything like that. They would be far too busy trying to stay alive and avoid all the numerous diseases of Earth without having time to worry about putting up ley lines or zodiacs. But nevertheless, both these things exist. Both of them are completely unsolved mysteries, an occasional drop of real information. I would like to emphasize that there has been more waffle written about both these things than one would ever imagine possible. But out of the entire waffle, one manages to squeeze an occasional drop of real information. I think that one can accept that the ley lines, the main ones, are perfectly genuine, that they were designed for pilgrims or passengers of various kinds to get from one place to another, and that zodiacs, too, certainly existed.
The Lost Voice. Sykes belonged to the last generation of the old straight track movement, but the ideas didn't disappear with them. A generation later, during the 60s and 70s, another remarkable British subculture began looking at the ancient landscape. Its language was different. Watkins had written about tracks and alignments. The new generation increasingly spoke of sacred geometry, geomancy, earth energies, and the spiritual qualities of place. Writers such as John Michel, Nigel Pennick, and Paul Devereux became prominent voices in this revival, while dozens of small magazines, journals, and newsletters carried the debate to an enthusiastic readership. The two generations were separated by a world war, and in many respects by an entirely different way of looking at the world. Yet, something connected them. The landscape itself, the standing stone on the horizon, the ancient church, the forgotten track across the field. Both generations shared the conviction that the British landscape contained a history and perhaps a meaning that could not always be found in conventional accounts of the past. Whether they were right about ley lines, terrestrial zodiacs, and earth energies is another question. Sykes died in 1983, 2 years after this interview. He was very generous with his time and with his bottle of sherry. He was a man of great character and wide experience who was good enough to share some of those experiences with me. With him disappeared one of the last personal links to the small group of enthusiasts who had gathered around Alfred Watkins' ideas half a century earlier. Sykes was no unquestioning believer, though. He could be dismissive, skeptical, and wonderfully blunt about what he regarded as bad research. But his skepticism never stopped him from asking questions. When I recorded this conversation, I could not have imagined that 40 years later I would be returning to it. The original tape appears to have disappeared. Perhaps it was thrown away. Perhaps it still survives somewhere in a forgotten box, in someone's personal library in the Cotswolds. I don't know, but the transcript remained, and perhaps there is something appropriate in that. A man who spent much of his life looking for traces of the past himself has become a trace. The voice has vanished, but the words remain.